Okay, y'all, let's get started. So we are going to be moving into talking about how you create forms on the client side today. We need to do that before we can have a discussion next week about how you collect information from forms and process that on the back-end server side. So actually today is primarily going to be about the client side and how you are able to create forms, interactive forms. Before we do that, we need to finish up with a discussion of regular expressions in PHP. And also I got some feedback from the TAs on a few mistakes that you'd made in homework 6 that I wanted to quickly go over. Also, I do publish the answers to the homework assignments, but no one really wanted to look at the homework 6 answers. I know this because they weren't published until last night. So feel free to tell me, please remember to publish the homework assignments. Blackboard used to allow us to put a date when it would be published, but Canvas doesn't have that feature, and therefore I have to remember. I don't always remember in a timely way, so don't hesitate to ask to see the solutions. I'm supposed to publish them 3 days after the due date. Okay, so on homework 6, there was an issue with this checking of the guest name to be 30 characters or less, and it said the guest name can be alphanumeric characters. Alphanumeric means alphabetical or numeric. It doesn't mean alphabetical. So according to the TA, a lot of you tried to write something like A to Z or capital A to Z or a space, and you would say something like 1 to 30. Except the problem with that is that that only allows for letters and for spaces. So in fact, that's where you need to use the \W, which matches any alphanumeric character, which is the alphabetic letters, numbers 0 to 9, and an underscore, which are also the allowable parts of a C or C++ variable name. Now, this actually, even if you wrote, not sure that I had the TA take off for this, but even if you wrote it like this isn't really correct. If you're trying to have a guest name that's 30 characters or less. And can someone tell me why even this isn't quite accurate? Yes, Trevor. It's because spaces could start it. And normally you don't think of a space as being something that can start a name. So really technically you need it to write it like this. 1 to 29. Now, you could even quibble with this. What's the quibble with this? It certainly starts with a. Now it forces to start with an alphanumeric character. There's still trailing spaces. So if you really wanted to make this completely, I think, accurate, you'd have to say something like 1 to 28 followed by that, and then you would need to have a second part. So you'd have to say it's a single character, or, and the second part handles anything that's 2 to 30 characters. And the second part forces actually now it would be 0. I'm sorry, now it would be 0 to 28. So now you would have a name that could be anywhere from 2 to 30 characters with something that begins and ends with an alphanumeric character and then can have spaces in the middle. And notice that even that another problem with this is it doesn't admit single character names. So you have to, when you're type checking form data, you have to be pretty careful about how you write regular expressions to avoid allowing unexpected names to, or unexpected data to creep in. This is really the correct way to write it. Either a single character or a name that is 2 to 30 characters long, with the first and last characters being alphanumeric, and then in the middle having an arbitrary number of alphanumeric characters or spaces. Okay. So again, bottom line, be careful about how you write regular expressions, because oftentimes you can be admitting stuff you didn't mean to admit. Same thing happened on D. The TA said a lot of you were accepting 4-digit codes with a leading 0. But you were told the 4-digit sequence was 1,000 to 9,999. So you actually had to write something that looked something like 1 to 9 and then D3 in order to get the right code for that. There's no way to otherwise limit or prevent a 0 from appearing in the first location. Okay, so that was 2 issues on number 2. And then on number 3, write a Perl script named time.pl that repeatedly prompts the user to enter military times. A bunch of you wrote infinite loops that never terminated. So the way the TA was testing this was with a redirect from standard in. She had a file and she redirected it into your script, and it never terminated because you never had a way of catching into file. Even if you're prompting a user, it's not acceptable to end a program with Control-C. Okay, that's not an acceptable way. You have to provide a user with a way to end it, either with an end of file character or with some predefined sentinel value. The reason is for exactly what happened, which is you never know in Unix if someone's going to redirect from standard in to some other file. And you can't, Control-C cannot be put into a file. So you should not design your programs to where the only way to get out of them is for someone to terminate them with a Control-C character. Okay? Because very often people are going to redirect standard in from a file. You can't get Control-C from a file. So you lost some fairly big points for writing infinite loops, because it's not a good practice to be in. Yes?
Would it have been acceptable to write something that was like enter military time or press Q to exit?
Yes.
Okay.
That would be
Even
fine.
if it was inside
because that way a user could write a file where Q is the last input, and that would terminate it. So basically you have to think about the fact that it could come from a file, and if it comes from a file, how is that file going to terminate? In that case, Q would terminate it, so you'd be good. Yep. And if the TA took off points for that, and there was a way to get out that wasn't Control-C, then talk to the TA, because she knows that there's supposed to be points given back for that. So those were the 2 big things. What was shocking, in a good way, was almost all of you got 5, which we thought would be the hardest problem. So that was good. Okay, questions about homework 6? Okay, so moving on. We did not finish up or didn't even get started with regular expressions in PHP. And regular expressions in PHP are important because you're going to be using them to type check form data. So that's something that you need to do a fair amount. And even if you think that you've type checked your data on the user or client side, it turns out that there are a multitude of ways for hackers to transmit data to the back end that bypass a front end client, and therefore you can't actually treat form data that you receive from the client as trustworthy. You actually need to type check all form data on the back end, even if you think that your web client type checked it on the front end. So PHP uses Perl-like regular expressions. So PHP uses Perl-like regular expressions. And it has basically, if you want to do some kind of match on a regular expression, it has a command preg match. And you give it in quotes a Perl pattern. So a Perl pattern. So you still use the slash symbols to delineate the regular expression like you would in Perl, but you also have to put quotes around it. And then you give it a string that is to be matched against, and then an optional array. And the array will contain all of the substrings that match parenthesized groups. So for example, if your string were, say, date 1, 2, date 1, 2, date 4, and you put parentheses around these 3 items, then the array is going to contain, if it matches, 4 entries. So entry 0 is always the full string that matches. So it is the full match. It's as though the full pattern had been put in parentheses. So it won't return the entire string, it'll just return the substring that matches the entire pattern. And then the remaining entries, 1 through n, are substrings that match parenthesized patterns. Okay, and remember, when you're type checking data, that is a very good idea to always put a caret at the beginning and a $sign at the end of the pattern so that you don't allow extraneous leading or trailing stuff, because that's a good way for a hacker to introduce code unexpectedly, is that they'll put a legitimate date, say at the beginning of that code string, but they'll also include a whole bunch of code after that. And if you're not being careful, you could end up admitting the whole thing as a valid date. So it's good to remember to put the caret at the beginning and the $sign at the end. So you're also allowed to have an array of strings here. So your allowed string may be an array of strings. And if that's the case, then the $ array will be a multidimensional array, with the 0 entry being a full match for the pattern on each string in the array, and then entries 1 to n being substrings that match the parenthesized patterns in each string in the array. So that way you can match on multiple pieces of data. And it returns true if there is a match. So it returns true. If the given pattern matches a substring. Okay, so that's going to be your workhorse. Okay. And finally, you can also do a preg match all. So preg match will only match the first substring that occurs, but if there's multiple occurrences of substrings that match the pattern, such as multiple dates in the string, it won't return all of them. Preg match all will return everything, so returns all matches. And again, substrings that match the pattern. And again, what you get back is a multidimensional array. So entries 1 through n will now include all of the matches that occurred, and entry 0 will include all the substrings that match the pattern. Okay, then if you want to do any questions about that? That'll be your workhorse.
By returns, you mean like puts it in the array?
Yes. Yes. Returns in $ array, all substrings. Yep. Okay. Then if you want to do substitution, which is less common, but it still happens, you would use preg. So this all stands for Perl regular expression. That's why preg. Replace. And now it's again a pattern but now confusingly the replacement pattern is not between the slashes. So the beginning, the pattern to be matched is between slashes, but the replacement pattern is not between slashes, and why that's true I don't know, but it is what it is. And then you have the $string, and that will replace all instances of pattern with the replacement pattern. Okay, and let's see. This can again be an array. And in fact, these two can be arrays as well if you want to do multiple search and replace in one fell swoop. Yes.
Does it do in place replacement or does it return new strings?
That was, I was just looking at my notes, trying to look at that, and I'm not sure, so I'm actually going to quickly try an example to figure that out. So let's do this and say $A equals Brad. Then we're going to do preg replace Brad with BVZ on A, and we'll print $A and see what happens. And it looks like it does not, so let's try that. Yep, so it does not do in place. It returns a copy. I'll change that in the notes. Well, add that in the notes. It was not an indication. So it returns a copy. Also, this is something, while I'm at it, you got to be careful about in PHP. So this is a handy thing you can do in Python. Does anyone know what happens when you do that in Python? The last element is set to 10. Watch what happens in PHP. It sets a new entry called -1 to 10. Anyone know why? It's just a hash table. So everything's a hash table. Even your so-called indexed arrays are hash tables. Actually, your arrays aren't as efficient as you might think. Okay, so just so you know, everything is a hash table. Pretty unifying thing. Okay, coming back here, that was preg replace, and then preg split will split something according to a split pattern, which is helpful because you do line at a time input in PHP, so you're going to have to break it somehow, and the way you break it is with preg split, and you again give it the pattern, and the string that you want, and that's definitely a set that equal to an array. You'll get back you'll get back the words or fields that use with the pattern as the delimiter. Now, you can also use explode instead, and that's just a single character and a string. So if you know that a single character separates everything, explode is faster. But it's dangerous because if more than one instance of the character matches, then you get unexpected results. So to show you, if I say $A, let's do Brad van der Zanden, $foo equals explode on a character, $A, and now I'll print $foo. This will work fine because there's a single character or space separating each word there. So that was expected. But now I'm going to put some extra spaces in here and run it again. And you can see there's a lot of extraneous entries. And what happened with all those extraneous entries is that when it had Brad, space, space, Vander, well, it considers what you see there between the two spaces to be a word, namely an empty. word. So it's actually using single characters to do the exploding, and if there's even nothing between two consecutive instances of the character, you'll get back an empty string. So you use explode very carefully, but the reason you might use explode is it's more efficient than preg split. So whichever you use in the homework is fine, provided I've assured you there's only one character always separating your fields. If there's more than one character, you'll have to use preg split. Okay, and as a reminder, the way that you could soak up that, actually think about it for a moment. If I wanted to do a preg split, how would I specify the pattern so that the extra spaces were swallowed or sponged up? \s, what? Plus. Yep. And that will hoover up any additional spaces. So that's it. Those are the three big regular expression workhorses: preg match, preg split, and preg replace. Questions about that? Okay. So with that, we're going to move on and talk about how you create interactive forms on the front end, on the client side, because basically PHP is designed to take its input from forms that are on the client side. It's not meant to take input from the console, which is what you've been used to up to now. In fact, probably should say that web programming is something that is fundamentally different than the kind of programming that you've been heretofore used to. Because first of all, input comes from forms/client, but usually from forms, but there are other ways you might get it from the client rather than a file or standard in. Okay, another thing that you'll have to get used to that's going to be difficult is that program state is forgotten once you respond to the client. That is, once a PHP script executes, it's done. It outputs whatever it outputs. That output is sent to the client. Client displays it in a browser. Script's done. Any values set for variables in that script are gone. Even if the script re-executes a second time when the client sends more information back, tough. The script starts executing from scratch again. So that's something you really have to get used to, because many of you are used to prompting the user for input. You get some input, you process it, you output something, you ask the user for more input, but when you ask the user for more input, you haven't lost any program state. But that's not true here. As soon as you send something back to the client, you finish, and now your program state's forgotten. So you have to do things like save any intermediate data or state in a database, or use something which are called PHP session variables, or use cookies, which we'll get to next week. At any rate, these two things can kind of mess you up. And then 3, output goes to a browser and is usually interpreted as HTML, not as plain text. So if you want to format your output, you actually have to use HTML tags rather than simply formatting it using printf and new line characters. So those are all things that are kind of different from the way you have been interacting with programs up till now. So the first thing then is, before we can do a whole lot with a PHP script, we first have to create the forms that are going to generate the input data that will then be sent to the PHP backend. And you see these forms all the time. For example, if I go to Amazon, see if it's still got my Christmas. Oh, good, it took off that. So before Christmas, it had a big sleigh. I'm sorry, before Halloween, it had a big sleigh up on it. It's like, hello, it's not even Halloween yet, and you got Santa up. But today they're pushing that looks like they're speaker systems. Actually, this isn't a very good example because there's not a whole lot of form data here. Actually, there's no form data. Okay, let's go to Expedia. Actually, let's go to Kayak. There we go. This is better because this actually has form data where you're entering information. So for example, here it's asking when do I want to return? It's popping up information that I can enter, like dates. Okay, here I have some menus about the kind of who's traveling. Here it has an email address, so that's a text box. There's different kinds of what we call widgets that the user can interact with. This is just a simple text box. This right here, the sign up, is a button. Back here, this is a menu. Okay, these are pop-down boxes, although they're also text boxes. So there, I start entering and it gives me something to enter. So it's more like a text box. This is a date button, so it pops up a date widget. So basically, forms consist of different widgets that allow people to enter information. And I'm first going to go over the types of widgets, and then we'll go over how you create the forms. So let me actually bring something up. Might help if I put VBZ here. Okay, so most of what you have are what are called selection widgets, and they allow you to select various items. So most of these you have dealt with. Radio buttons, they allow you to select one from a number of choices. There are checkboxes, which allow you to do multiple selections. So basically, radio buttons and checkboxes group choices together, but radio buttons only allow a unique choice, whereas checkboxes allow multiple choices. Then you have menus that also allow a fair number of choices. And menus could allow either a single choice or many choices. We'll get to when you would use each in a moment. Then we have text boxes where you can enter anything you want. And you have things like password boxes that actually just hide visually what the user is entering but aren't actually secure. What they send is unencrypted, but See, it even says it. This connection is not secure. Logins entered here could be compromised. All they're doing is visually protecting what you're entering, but they'll send whatever I enter here as plain text. You have text boxes, so here you can enter multiple lines of text. Oops. Yep, well, I hit the caps button. You can do sliders, not very elegant yet, but you can do sliders. There's color widgets for selecting colors. Yuck. But if we go here, we get, select colors. And now I just click submit. You can see that it comes up with what I entered. And that's a PHP script running on the back end. So for example, skill, we go back. I said super hacker, which was transmitted as sup. How many hours do you spend programming each week? 11 to 20. Here the color is some strange kind of orangish thing, and it's giving me what is an RGB rating. So the first two hexes are red, which is 255. The next two are green, which is roughly a half green. That's not true. It's roughly a third green. And the third one is blue, and that's about a fifth blue. So it will try to print it out in whatever way it gets printed out. And there's a lot of other widgets that have been introduced but aren't supported by your major browsers yet. So for example, there's a date widget that you can use that only Chrome really supports right now. And if you go to W3 Homes, you can find a lot of the other widgets. But as I said, there's still limited support for many of these widgets from the browsers. So if you look at the code back here for select your favorite color, you'll see that I'm using a tag input type equals color, and that's telling the browser that I want a color widget. But as I said, that's up to the browser as to whether it's going to give you a nice representation of it. By default, if they don't support it, they'll just give you a text box. So if I had input type equals date there, I just would have gotten a text box because Firefox doesn't support dates. Although the claim is that Firefox version 57 will support the date widget, and the release date is November 14th, which is less than a week. So maybe if I gave this lecture next week, I could actually show you what Firefox has in mind for the date widget. But as of version 56, it's still not supported. Okay, so you have a lot of different ways to submit data. And there are some rules of thumb as to which widget you're going to select. So let me talk about that. So these are all in some sense selecting pieces of information, so which widget to use. The first admonition is, if at all possible, avoid using text boxes. Avoid using text boxes. And the reason for that is it's just too easy for a user to enter invalid data. One of the principal kind of guidelines of user interfaces is prevent the user from making mistakes. But text boxes make it all too easy for a user to make a mistake. So avoid using text boxes because they make it easy for the user to enter invalid data. Okay. They also make use of what is called recall memory as opposed to recognition memory. So recognition memory means that if I present you with a list of choices, like let's say I ask you, how do you delete a piece of text in Microsoft Word? So recognition memory would be if I showed you, if I gave you a list of commands. So let's actually bring up a Word file quickly. So recognition memory is where I actually pop up a menu like this. So I've selected it. And recognition memory is I give you these options and you recognize that cut is the right command. That's recognition memory. Recall memory would be me just sitting here and saying, okay, what is it? And you're trying to remember, delete, no. Remove, no. Okay, that's recall memory. You have to remember without any prompting. Much harder to recall things than it is to recognize things. So when at all possible, we try to make use of people's recognition memory rather than people's recall memory. Text boxes force users to depend on recall memory. Also, just so you know, experts use recall memory. Beginners and intermediate users use recognition memory. And that's why experts actually have an advantage, because actually when it's coming from recall memory, you're faster. Because you don't have to pop up a menu to figure out what you're doing. You actually can normally just type it in. That's why you actually have so-called keyboard shortcuts. On the right-hand side, you can see flower X is cut, because an expert will just push the flower X to cut, and that's much faster than popping up a menu. You might wonder, why is it much faster? It's because whenever your hands leave the keyboard, it involves what is called a context switch. Just like operating systems have context switches between processes, your brain does a context switch every time your hand leaves the keyboard and has to find the tablet and has to go up. In effect, it swaps out what it was working on so it can focus on the new task. That context switch costs time. Same thing. After you've made the selection, you have to context switch back to where you were in the document. That's 2 context switches. And it costs you time. So experts benefit by being able to use recall memory. It irritates me when students complain to me on tests that they shouldn't have to memorize programming constructs because they could look it up in the real world. Okay? If you go looking up everything in the real world, you will be an unproductive programmer, and the person who has it memorized is going to get the raises and the bonuses and the promotions while you wonder why you're being left behind. Okay? There is a big advantage to memorization. It's there at your fingertips much faster. You don't context switch trying to look stuff up. Okay. However, all that said, when we're dealing with user interfaces, for the most part, we're assuming that we're working with novice to intermediate users, not power users. So we try to avoid using text boxes if we can. So if we are choosing numbers in a limited range, use a slider. Now, limit it is going to depend on a lot of things. It's going to depend, for example, on your screen resolution. If you have 1,000 pixels wide, if you only have 1,000 pixels on your screen, you can't have more than 1,000 numbers on your slider, because you'll need 1 pixel per number. In practice, you need 3 or 4 pixels per number, because the user is not going to be so precise that they can get it centered on a single pixel. So you kind of have to have an idea of how big your resolution is, how big your screen real estate is. If it's 1,000 pixels wide and you have 1 inch and there's 10-inch wide screen, you only have 100 pixels of screen real estate. So you might only be able to squeeze about 30 values into that. So you have to know how much screen real estate you're working with in order to know whether you can use a slider or not. There are other tools you can use, like increment and decrement boxes, but generally the slider you try to use for numbers, and if it's really big numbers, you have to revert to text boxes. Okay? If it's from a limited set of choices, a limited discrete set of choices, you have 3 options. You can use radio buttons, you can use check boxes, or you can use menus. So you have a choice of radio buttons, check boxes, or menus. Okay, you use radio buttons for single selection. You use check boxes for multiple selection. And you use menus for either. So the question then is, when do you use a menu? And when do you use checkboxes? I'm sorry, when do you use a menu and when do you use radio buttons or checkboxes? This again goes back to the human brain. So, the next thing you need to know is that a human or an adult has a working memory of 7 items plus or minus 2. So it's basically 7 items plus minus 2. So really it's a range of 5 to 9. What that means for us is that someone looking at a list of 7 items can pretty much instantly load that into working memory. Working memory is like high-speed cache. Okay, they can load 7 items directly just by glancing. If I show you a menu with 7 items on it, just by glancing at it, you can put all 7 items immediately into working memory, most of you. Okay, some of you can put 9 items in, some of you are limited to 5. If the number of items in a list exceeds your working memory, you resort to linear search. So you start scanning, your brain starts scanning linearly. So if you're generally 7 items or less, it's like order 1 access. And if it's more than the items in working memory, it's like order n access, which gives you an idea of when you should use radio buttons and checkboxes, which is typically when it's less than or equal to 7 items, you typically use radio buttons or checkboxes, and if it's more than 7 items, you typically use a menu. Now that's not a hard and fast rule, but it's a pretty good guideline. Okay? It also so happens that 7 is a relatively small number. That means your footprint on the screen isn't going to be particularly large. screen real estate is valuable. And there's only so much screen real estate visible at any moment. So if you have, say, 50 items that can be selected, like 50 states, and you try to put them all on the screen, that's going to take up a considerable amount of screen real estate, and that's not a good use of it. So it also is nice, 7 or less. It's nice in the sense that that's a relatively small footprint. Now, menus have very small footprints. Okay, going back to that kayak, probably don't have it anymore, but we can get it back pretty quickly. This one adult economy is very compact. When I click on the menu, notice how big it becomes. So a menu takes up very little screen real estate, but can display a tremendous amount of information by temporarily taking up a big portion of the display. But notice there's a big X here so that when I'm done, it goes away and it's back to just occupying a small part of the display. Okay. So again, you might use radio buttons or checkboxes for more than 7 items, but you should have a good reason for doing so. Okay. And then menus you typically use for more than 7 items as long as it's still a limited, discrete set of choices. Okay. Now, there's a limit to that. There is a limited, discrete number of zip codes in the US. You would not try to represent those using a menu. There's just too many of them. You would have to go with a text box for that. However, it might be the case that if you're just talking about Knox County, then you might show the zip codes in a menu because that's a more manageable number. So you have to kind of have an idea of how much you have and make a decision about whether it goes in a menu or as buttons or as a text box. But basically, a text box should be a last resort. Okay? And that's why the W3 consortium introduced all of these additional widgets like date pickers, color choosers, so that there would be kind of domain-specific ways to select or to input data without forcing the user to have to input it. It's a lot harder to choose a color when you have to give an RGB rating. So the way they get colors is you give a red rating between 0 and 255, a green rating between 0 and 255, and a blue rating between 0 and 255. Well, without seeing it, it's kind of hard to know what the color is going to look like. Okay, so the color choosers are there to make it a lot easier to select colors. Okay. So that's the basic thing for making choices. And then, as I said, you have some variations, like you could use a text box or a text area or a password box depending on what type of text data you're collecting. So once you have a widget, there may be a few choices within that. Something else you might notice, here's a menu. Notice that there's some dividers in that menu. So there's 4 items, then a line, then closed, then a horizontal line, then 5 items, then a horizontal line, and 2 items. Okay? There's a reason why they do that. Anyone have a guess? Splits it up so it's easier to see. Can you go a little beyond that? Because you're right. They're splitting it up so it's easier to see. And
They're basically like in categories.
and they're in categories, right. So they're categorizing it into related categories. And
each of the categories is less than 7.
And each category is less than 7 items. So everything you all said, so what happens is you quickly scan the list using linear search till you find the category that you think is right. But once you find the category you think is right, because there's fewer than 7 items in it, you can suck all those items immediately into working memory and make a faster choice. So that's why you often see menus divided into multiple parts like that, and almost always the divisions will be such that there are fewer than 7 items in each division. Okay, so that's the theory. What about practice? How do we actually get these things onto a page? Well, let's have a look. So what happens is there's HTML, and HTML has markup tags that allow you to create form widgets. So a form starts with the keyword form, and it has 2 attributes. So you have tags that start with a angled brace, and then you have attributes that further describe what's happening. The form tag has 2 main attributes. One is the way the information is transmitted to the server. So that's method. Method controls how the information is transmitted. Action is the name of the script that should process this form data on the server side. Okay? And the method, there's 2 primary methods, get and post. So the 2 primary methods are get and post. So get transmits form data as part of the URL. Whereas post hides the form data. And only transmits the script name. So what effectively happens when I submit a form is that it actually gives, when you submit, it actually calls whatever the name of the, it creates a URL, typically with the same directory as the page that it was served from. And then, if it's a post, this is all that appears. Unfortunately, I can't make that bigger, so we'll do it here. So if I'm coming from, say, web.eecs.utk.edu /bvz/php, and that's where the forms.html comes from, and the name of the script is foo.php, then that is the URL that the browser will construct. Now, if it's a get, it will also transmit form data with that URL. Okay? And it will be in the form, you'll see a question mark, and then name value pairs. So name 1 equals value 1. Ampersands are used as delimiters. Name 2 equals value 2, where the names are the names of your widgets and the values are the values they are set to. So with get, you'd see a string that includes the form data. The form data is placed after the question mark. With post, you'd only see the foo up to the foo.php, and the form data is transmitted via another mechanism. So get makes it a lot easier for people to bypass your web interface, because someone can simply type in a string that looks like this, and as long as they're familiar with the names of the widgets on your form, they can completely bypass your web interface, which is one of the reasons why you can't trust the data that you receive from the client. Some hacker could completely bypass your web interface and use bad data there. So you might say, well, I'll just use post. Well, it turns out hackers can also get around post. It's just a little more complicated. So the question is, when do you use get and when do you use post? You use get typically when it's an inquiry, whereas post is when you're going to change information on the back end. So you're using get, so typically used if only retrieving info and not modifying. Whereas post is typically used if you're modifying. Okay, it's also used if there's more than 100 characters. There's a couple other things. If there's non-ASCII values, then you also have to use post rather than get. So there's some other ones that are listed in the notes. So get makes it easy for web crawlers to access your site, which you may desire. Okay? It may very well be that, like if you're a travel company and you want Kayak to be able to easily access your site, you might well have get as your transmission so that an automated robot effectively can submit queries to your site and get responses back. So that's get versus post. Okay, so you have your form, and then it ends with a bracket, and in HTML, all tags must end with a similar tag, but with a /. So at the very end of the form, to show where it ends, you have the end tag for the form. In between is where all the form elements go. Now typically there would be a name here as well, because you could have multiple forms. So this might be the job application form. So typically you would also have a name attribute for a form, so that on the server side you'd know which form had actually submitted. Then there are different ways to create widgets. They typically begin with the tag input. Most of the widgets begin with the tag input. And then a type attribute controls which type of widget appears. So radio will create a radio button, checkbox will create a checkbox, text creates a text box, date creates a date picker, color creates a color chooser, range creates a slider. You can look it up. I typically have to look that up. Then you typically provide a name for the widget, and remember there's name value pairs. Well, the name you provide is the name that will be given to this widget when it becomes a key into a hash table, essentially. So whatever name you provide, that will be the key. in a hash table on the back end, and the value is the value that will be given as that key on the back end. So before, when I clicked super hacker, you can see here that the value was equal to soup, and that's why soup was transmitted as the skill. And sometimes there's additional attributes. I'm not going to go through them all. You can look them up in the notes. But for example, if you want a default widget checked, then you use the checked attribute, and that will cause it to be checked. That will be the default value when it comes up. When you give the same name to a group of radio buttons or to a group of checkboxes, then they'll all be treated as part of the same group, which means for a radio button, only one of them can be selected at a time. For a checkbox, what it means is that multiple values can be transmitted as an array. The one exception to the input is the menu. Menus, instead of starting with menu, start with select as the tag. So this is a menu. And you see the name, and this is important that you have the square braces at the end of the name, because that tells the CGI backing this that it needs to transmit the answers as an array rather than as a single value. If you don't do that, then the CGI backing it for certain scripting languages will only transmit a single value, even if it allows multiple values. So here this says that the size equals 5 says that 5 menu items can be displayed at a time. So that says how big its screen footprint is. And this says that multiple menu items may be selected. Then the individual menu items start with the option tag, and they have a value, but they may be given a different name than their value. So Alabama will be transmitted as AL, but show up as Alabama. Okay, text boxes, they again are input, type equals text. You can provide an initial value, and that's the text string that will show up. But if you type in something else, then that something else is what will get transmitted. And you can also specify the size of the text box. So if you say size equals 50, a text box big enough to accommodate 50 characters will appear. If you, I think it's max chars, I forget, I'd have to check. You can specify the maximum number of characters that can be entered. And if you do that, then no more than that number of characters can be entered into the text box. So a text area, you can see there you can specify rows and columns, the number of rows and columns that show up. If there's more rows, then if the user enters 10 rows, then a scroll bar will appear. Only 5 rows will show up, and you can scroll back and forth. Hidden fields are ones that actually won't show up. So here's a hidden field. It won't show up in your form, but it can be used to transmit data that the client might need. So in this case, a promotion code might be transmitted. Many of you took CS102 and used Code Assessor. Code Assessor transmits a bunch of information through hidden fields, such as your number of attempts that you have left or your current score per box. So hidden fields are a good way to transmit essentially variable values to the JavaScript that is backing the client. But the user won't see it. Hidden fields are not secure. All I have to do, for those of you who don't know it, if you want to see what is creating this page, there is in just about every browser, something called page source. Wait. Oh, it was? Oh, they grayed it out. Cute. So they don't want me looking at it. Okay, I guess there's a way to hide the page source. Might still, okay. At any rate, here's mine, and I can go and look at the page source. So it's not like hidden is going to be very secure. It's just a way to transmit information to the back end. Okay, so last thing then, or not second to last thing, there is a way to submit. So if there's a type equals submit, and the value field is what will show up on the button. So in this case, the button would say submit the data. And when you click submit, that calls the action script. Reset will reset the form data to its default values. Whatever they started with will be reset to that. So hitting submit causes the action script to be executed, and the form data is collected and sent either using the get or post method, whichever one you specified. Okay. Now, I'll go over briefly, I'll wrap up here because I only have a minute left. But one thing that you might like to do is have something that's a little more attractive than just a linear list of widgets like this. Like Kayak has a pretty spiffy looking web interface. So first of all, they're using something called cascading style sheets for this to specify formatting. And oftentimes you can use tables. Now that's not what so-called sophisticated designers use, but for your purposes, using tables, you can often organize widgets into nice columns and rows like you see for Kayak. So we'll briefly on Tuesday talk about how to organize your widgets using tables, and then we'll move on and talk about how you handle form data on the back end side. So have a good weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday.